It's been 25 years since the death of Kurt Cobain. The Nirvana frontman heralded rock's grunge era of the early 1990s, tapping into a collective state of mind through earnest songwriting that challenged the angst and alienation of his time. Now, 25 years later, Cobain's impact on music remains as important as ever. And while he hated being called the voice of a generation, his legacy is ultimately exactly that. This is TicToc. I'm Andrew Mach. Joining me today is Danny Goldberg. He was Nirvana's co-manager from 1990 until Kurt Cobain's death. Mr. Goldberg, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So your new book, Serving the Servant, Remembering Kurt Cobain, is out. Tell me, what was the message you wanted to get across with this book?
I just wanted to paint the portrait of the Kurt Cobain that I knew, which was a little different from the kind of footprint that I thought had gotten out there over the years. I worried that his death had overshadowed his life, and I just had this desire to kind of tell my version of what it was knowing him and working with him, and this seemed like the right time to do it.
And what is that version? Let's dive a little bit deeper into that. Who is the Kurt Cobain that you experienced?
Well, he's certainly, first and foremost, to me, an artist. He was a real genius. As someone who thinks rock and roll is an art form, I think he's one of the great exponents of that art form. And in the context of Nirvana, he wrote the songs, all the famous songs, the lyrics and the music. He was the lead singer and the lead guitar player. He designed the album covers, he designed the T-shirts, he storyboarded the videos, and he made all the decisions for the band. And I think the body of work really went deeper than a lot of just hit records do. When Nevermind exploded in America in the fall of 1991, it also became a success all over the world almost instantly. And now, 25 years later, I see people, teenagers and people in their 20s, wearing Nirvana T-shirts, many of whom were not even alive when Kurt died. And I think that has something to do with the depth with which he addressed teenage issues and issues of alienation and loneliness, so that he not only had a mastery of the commercial mechanics of several different kinds of popular music, pop, punk, and metal, but he had a almost metaphysical connection to people's insides. So I think that his genius is really worth remembering. I'm of the hippie generation. I was older than Kurt, and I was a big fan of Jimi Hendrix. And when I think of Hendrix, I don't think of his death as much of his guitar solos. So, on the one hand, I thought it was worth just walking through the series of dozens of decisions that Kurt made that created this body of work. And he was also somebody, although he was prone to depression, he did have struggles with heroin till the end of his life. He did kill himself grotesquely and tragically. He was certainly not depressed all the time. He was a warm, funny, loving guy a lot of the time. He was particularly nice to me and a lot of the people around him. To the extent he had darkness inside him, it was almost all directed at himself. Not everybody who's brilliant is a nice person or a good listener, but he really was. So I wanted to show that side of him. I interviewed around 40 people that I knew during those years. It's not a biography of Kurt. Others have covered his childhood fine. I wanted to just cover those 3.5 years when I knew him, and I talked to a number of people from that period, and I found most of them shared this same feeling of just bittersweet feeling, but not all bitter. The sweet part is the love and the sweetness that people were able to remember. So I don't sugarcoat the dark sides, but as a matter of proportionality, I think it's a picture of him that's a little different from the sort of meme of the suicidal Kurt Cobain that was out there, and that's what I set out to accomplish. I hope some of his actual spirit comes through when people read it.
You mentioned you're from the hippie generation. I wonder how, coming from that generation, how your image of the music industry and working with artists changed when you worked with Kurt Cobain.
Well, the industry part of it was pretty easy, honestly, with Nirvana, because that album just exploded so dramatically. The public loved Smells Like Teen Spirit so quickly that it was not particularly hard to market, and it wasn't particularly hard to negotiate advances for them, or figure out the economics of touring or any of that. The hard part was dealing with the emotional issues that came up, the scrutiny of the media, and so forth. I don't think that it really changed my idea of the music business, but it exposed me to a brilliant person the likes of which I never had met before or since.
You mentioned the kids and teens today that are growing up and getting into Nirvana's music, who maybe were never even around or never even really knew of Kurt Cobain when he was still alive. What's something that you think would be surprising for them to know about the artist?
I have no idea what would surprise anybody, but I just tried to paint the picture of him as I knew him. And if you're a fan of his, I think it'll give you a little different picture of him than what else has been out there. He had a great work ethic, a great love of art. He was not somebody that wanted to hang around with other rock stars or movie stars or get expensive clothes or expensive cars or anything like that. When he became successful, he was driven to just do more art and to stay with the few people that he'd already known. And he had a view of the world that was progressive by today's political definitions. He didn't want to be a political preacher and be one of those quote-unquote political artists, but he also didn't shy away from being very firm about his support of feminism and gay rights and his revulsion at macho orthodoxy and at the dark side of capitalism. He was a real product culturally of the sort of 80s punk rebellious culture, but he added to that this musical sophistication that allowed him to also write songs that would get played on radio stations around the world, which other punk artists didn't.
You talk about sort of the image he wanted to present and his sort of values that seem like maybe they were ahead of his time. I wonder if that is perhaps a reason why his legacy still persists today. Do you think that's something?
I don't really know. I think there's a certain amount of mystery about why certain art lasts and others doesn't, whether it's paintings or classical music or movies or theater. We've seen certain artists, like Bob Marley comes to mind, who somehow feels fresh even decades after they're not on the planet anymore. It's a tiny handful of artists like that, and I think Kurt is one of them. But I don't know that you can pin down exactly why, whether it's just the accessibility and raw emotion in his voice, whether it's the cleverness of the lyrics that just somehow poetically get at certain inner feelings that are in a unique way, whether it's just the totality of what he stood for in the culture as kind of an antidote to the macho version of masculinity. Whatever it is, it's definitely transcended the early 90s.
You talked about this dark side that Kurt Cobain was prone to, and of course, as we all know, he did die by suicide. He struggled with depression. Do you think, as our society has sort of changed since then, and the conversation has shifted on the importance of mental health, do you think there are some lessons to glean from Kurt Cobain's life?
I don't really know. I tried. I'm not a psychiatrist or a spiritual leader, so I just have as much information as I could find out as a layperson about what the current thinking is about suicides, and I was not able to find any evidence that people really know exactly what to do to reduce suicides. I think in an individual case, I certainly am a big believer in 12-step program, which is certainly not new to this era, but I think continues to be for people with addictions probably the most successful on a percentage basis of any of the kinds of therapies out there. I certainly don't know anything about the science of antidepressants. I know Kurt tried the ones that were available when he was alive, and they didn't seem to help all that much. I'm a believer in prayer and meditation, but it's not for everybody. Some people are transformed by it, and some people, just can't get into it. I'm not sure that the society at large knows much more about how to deal with the phenomenon of suicide than it did 25 years ago. But I think that you do the best you can, because every life is precious, and if you love somebody, you try to let them know it and give them whatever support's available. But you also have to honor the fact that there's a mystery to the human mind that the established order has not so far figured out.
You mentioned you had interviewed dozens of people for this new book of yours. Were there things that you found out that you were surprised yourself to have learned, even things you didn't know when you were working with him?
There were minor anecdotes that just fleshed out things for me and added some richness. I think details help bring people to life. So, there were when Nirvana was first an indie label, they couldn't afford apartments, and they would often stay at the on the road, even in Seattle, in the home of local promotion people, and then later on when he became successful, he would still have one of them cut his hair, not ever going to a hair salon or anything like that. And the way that he was with individual people. There's no headlines in this book. His life was widely documented in the big events, most of which I was there for. I can describe through my eyes, but they're not that different. What I hope is that the aggregation of details just humanizes him, because he was a beautiful human.
And to close, for the people who are going to read this book, perhaps there are 1,000,001 answers to this question, but I wonder what are some of the key takeaways? What's something you want a reader to walk away with now, having read this book?
I don't know. I just, go back and listen to some of his music, try to be a good person, try to emulate the generous side of him. If you know anybody that's got a drug problem, try to get them into treatment. I wouldn't. I'm not an artist like Kurt was, but I try in the book to give an artistic version of his life, and I just hope it touches people. The way anybody who does, writes a book or writes a song hopes their work affects people. It's not a political treatise, that's for sure. But I will say this: Kurt definitely would have hated the policies of Donald Trump. There was this dreadful internet meme about a year ago or two that invented a quote saying that Kurt had predicted Trump would become president. That is not true. Kurt was voted Democratic. He was not an anarchist, and he was, by today's terms, a progressive. But as far as the book goes, if you love Kurt Cobain and their music, I hope I paint a picture of him that's makes it worth reading. I did the best I could. I love the guy, and it seemed like the right time to do it while enough people were still alive, but there's enough distance that people could get away from some of the anguish of losing him.
All right, that's all very good to know. Again, I've been speaking with Danny Goldberg. He was Nirvana's co-manager from 1990 until Kurt Cobain's death. He's also the author of the new book, Serving the Servant, Remembering Kurt Cobain. Danny, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much for speaking to me about the book.
And I'm Andrew Mach. You can follow me on Twitter at Andrew J. Mach and get all of your news updates 24/7 at TicToc.